where I'm actually looking at. All right, we will figure this out. I am so sorry. There, how about that?
Looks good. We can see the presentation.
All right. My apologies. Like I said, I have two computer screens and I'm always okay, we'll just do it like this. So as Brianna said, I am at the University of Kentucky and I've been studying these topics for over a decade. It's actually why I got into library science school and then went on and get my PhD. Um, was my interest in censorship and intellectual freedom. Um, Here are images of the books. And you can find them by going to Bloomsbury Publishing and typing in my last name. I also recently just got funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services for a 3-year project looking at how libraries are responding to book challenges. So all that is to say, this is right within my wheelhouse. It's something I love studying and talking about, and I'm really excited to be talking with you all today. So let's talk about book censorship in the US for just a little bit. These are numbers come from the American Library Association. Each year, state library associations collect data about book challenges and bans in their respective states and send it sort of up the chain to the American Library Association. And you can see just a few years ago in 2020, under 300 books were challenged or banned across the United States. 2021, as we move more towards the present, that number jumped significantly. Now, I suspect this has something to do with the pandemic. More people were using the public library, more people were seeing what their kids were reading and studying through schooling at home. I also think people got really frustrated with sort of societal changes and challenges and that sort of thing. But anyway, we do see this rapid rise in the number of book challenges. And you can see this has continued through the present day. The numbers for 2023, over 4,200 books were challenged or banned across the United States. This is a 65% increase from the previous year, from 2022. So this is only accelerating. Book bans continue to spread. They occur in all 50 states. No state is immune to this. And often we think of this as a problem in red states or rural areas, but it actually occurs in virtually every community. And here you can see the attempts to restrict access to books in the state of Maryland. This map comes from the Office for Intellectual Freedom of the American Library Association. You can see there were only 13 attempts to ban books in Maryland, but those 13 attempts involved almost 150 books. So most attempts in Maryland in the past year involved multiple challenges, multiple books for each challenge. And we see that more and more across the United States. Sort of in the old days or in the before times, people used to come in and say, I'm concerned about this one book. What can we do? I don't want my kid to read it. Now we see people challenging a dozen books at once, or all the books that have LGBT content. And so this is really a dramatic change, and this partially explains the rise in numbers in the titles being challenged and banned. So in other words, as I say here, book challenges and bans are an enormous problem right now. The data makes that very clear. This is especially true in public and school libraries. Public libraries saw a 60% increase in the number of challenges in the past year, for example. But I don't think this is going away anytime soon. I think book bans and challenges are going to be with us for at least the foreseeable future. This also involves more than books. We see challenges to programming, different resources, displays, audiovisual content, even databases. Some libraries in Wyoming, Louisiana, Arkansas, and a few other states have had, for example, EBSCO challenge. The fact that they provide access to the EBSCO database has been challenged because you can find some controversial resources through searches in EBSCO. So most of you probably know this already, but I always like to just refresh our minds why our challenge is a bad thing. The role of libraries, of course, is to provide access to information, and not just information, but almost all information. We provide information that may be controversial, that may be sensitive. We provide a wide range of views, including information that may not be popular. But we want to really provide access to all of this information. In contrast, of course, book bans try to restrict access to information. It's typically based on the content of books or the age of potential users, potential readers. And I think book bans are really antithetical to the purpose of libraries. And I mean that with respect to all types of libraries, not just public libraries or school libraries, academic libraries as well. So why are library resources being challenged? We see this dramatic rise. What's behind it? And we hear two words over and over again. That is difficult content. We hear that libraries are providing access to difficult content or controversial content. And those are the phrases that get used over and over. But what does that mean, difficult content? What the heck is that? Well, I would suggest difficult content really means that it's one of these three categories that are involved. So we see an enormous increase in challenges to content and authors that are LGBTQIA positive. Again, with the number of wide challenges, like people coming in and challenging a dozen books or 200 books in some cases, they're challenging all of the books with LGBTQIA content. A second reason that library resources are often challenged has to do with content that involves protagonists and authors who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. I also sometimes see this being called DEI content, books that involve things like structural racism, generational poverty, the injustice of the carceral system. All these sort of themes get wrapped up into DEI content, and this sort of stuff is often challenged as well. And then finally, the third category of frequently challenged materials has to do with sexually explicit content. This could include things like sex scenes, even kissing sometimes, books about sex education, and books that include scenes of rape or incest. So I'm going to show you this next slide, and you probably can't read it. That's okay. These are the 10 books that were the most frequently challenged in 2023. And
Sorry,
if
Shannon,
you,
we're
yeah.
still, the slide that we can see right now is still the map of the US.
Dang it. I'm so sorry. I wonder why that is. That is super frustrating. Okay. Where did my Zoom go? Okay, now did it change?
Yeah, so now
Okay,
we can see your slideshows.
that's a shame because these are great slides. So I am so sorry about that, folks. I've done a few of these. You'd think I would know how to do this by now. Okay, so these challenges are a bad thing. Here's the fun slide with resources being challenged, the reasons they're challenged, and then the slide with the 10 most challenged books of 2023. And again, if you want to read these details, you can find this by Googling the Office for Intellectual Freedom most challenged books. But I show this slide not necessarily so we can get lost in all the details, but just to say all 10 of these books were challenged for the reasons on the previous slide. They contain LGBTQIA content, they're sexually explicit, and or they contain protagonists and themes about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And often multiple of these reasons are involved. You can see some books are very new, like Gender Queer and All Boys Aren't Blue. Some books are a little dated or older, like The Perks of Being a Wallflower and The Bluest Eye. So this is the problem, but what is the bigger picture? The bigger picture has to do with right-wing movements to restrict access to materials that challenge a traditional worldview. It's often a religious underpinning or a foundation. And I do want to note here that not all book challenges come from the right. The center and the left challenge books and other resources as well. And we'll talk about some of that later. But overwhelmingly, the current spate of book challenges is coming from right-wing movements. And I think this is a response to the increasing social acceptance and the frank conversations around changing demographics, around LGBTQIA acceptance and visibility in our culture. Many people in society are having frank conversations about the carceral system, reparations, structural racism. And those frank conversations make some people really uncomfortable, right? And then, of course, we have changing demographics in the United States. We will soon be a country in which more people are of color than are white or Caucasian. And I think there's a big fear of our changing society and the implications of that. If folks are fearing that changing society might have negative implications for them and their family, then they may be motivated to challenge some of these books. And really what this comes down to is that libraries are for everyone. Libraries are positioning themselves and designed for everyone, for everyone in the community to feel welcome. And not everybody likes that. Not everybody wants libraries to be for everyone, unfortunately. Really, it boils down to representation. And representation involves seeing yourself and seeing others in library materials. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop doesn't always get credit for this, but she sort of originated the metaphors of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. These are different ways that we can see ourselves in library materials or see other people. And I really like this portrayal of the idea about representation. We need diverse representation, not only so every kid can see themselves as the hero of a story, which is, I think, is really important for marginalized folks. But we also need every kid to understand that other types of people are also heroes of the story. And to bring this home, I want to talk about two books in particular. One is All American Boys. It is a young adult novel about police brutality, unfair police brutality visited on a young Black boy. And I read it during the pandemic when I was leading a banned books reading club. And this book was really a window for me into another life, into a worldview that is not my own. And I was able to really see what individuals in the Black community felt and experienced, how they saw community reactions and that sort of thing. It was a really empowering and powerful book. And then the other book is called Plays Well with Others. And this is a book from the late 1990s. I know it came out before 2000 because that's when I graduated college. And I read this as an undergrad at my academic library. And at that point in my life, I had come out to myself as a lesbian, but not to very many people around me. I was still really unsure about what that meant for my life and my identity moving forward. And I didn't really have any resources to provide those answers. But I found some answers in this book, actually. It became both a mirror and a window, a sliding glass door for me. This book is about a group of ragtag artists, musicians living in New York City in the late 1980s and 90s, right as the AIDS epidemic is crushing the LGBT community. And it let me see that there were a lot of different lives, a lot of different possibilities for queer lives. That there were a lot of ways I could be queer in the world. And it also gave me a sense of cultural history. This is what people who are like me went through. And at that point in my life as an undergrad, I worked in the computer lab in the library, in the academic library. And once I logged in and clocked in, I would sneak off to the stacks, find this book, read a couple chapters, and then hide it back in the stacks for, my next shift. I'm sure we've all seen people do similar sorts of things in our libraries. And I suspect the librarians probably knew what I was doing. But for me, it was a very powerful book to read, and it really opened my eyes and gave me comfort at a time I needed it. So I always like to tell these stories to kind of personalize the idea of mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors. And it also provides a segue into pivoting to academic libraries. I think with intellectual freedom in academic libraries, and particularly in our present age, there are 5 things to really keep in mind. And those are collection development, programming, DEI initiatives, information literacy training, and social justice censorship. So collection development in academic libraries is frankly not my area of expertise, but I know that most academic libraries collect in at least the 5 categories on the left, right? Fiction, nonfiction, a lot of digital content. There may be art or decorations on the wall. At the University of Kentucky, we have an amazing collection of historic quilts throughout the library and other resources that are provided that are available. Now, many of these things may be challenged by community members, students, or even faculty. Why do we have fiction books in the library? Why do we have movies that are rated R when we might have some students who are under the age of 18? Students themselves may challenge the inclusion of some materials as being inappropriate for that setting. I've also heard of academic librarians being asked or I should say asked by their administration to remove or not add certain topics to the collection. This may be upper library administration, this may be university administration. But sometimes we get told that maybe we don't need such a robust LGBTQ collection, for example. Maybe we don't need books by Palestinian authors and poets. And oftentimes it's implicit that these asks or these requests have some budget implications, right? It's sort of an underlying theme that there may be some budget implications if we don't follow these requests. There can also be a form of self-censorship, sometimes called quiet censorship. Maybe collection development librarians preemptively decide to not include certain materials in their next order. You know, there are a lot of libraries in smaller communities, rural areas, red states, and they may decide maybe we don't need such a robust collection in this area. The public library down the street is dealing with challenges. I've heard my neighbors ranting about what's in libraries. Maybe we just won't order these books this time. And that's called quiet censorship or self-censorship, when the librarians are actually making those decisions preemptively. Another area that academic librarians should be thinking about is programming or displays. And there are multiple ways that this can come to light, right? There are freedom of speech issues. I know a lot of academic libraries do something like this image here, put up a whiteboard, ask a question, and as a sort of passive programming, have students just write responses. What do you do if somebody writes something inappropriate? What do you do if somebody writes something explicit or that could be considered discriminatory or hate speech? This actually reminds me of when I was getting my PhD, the university wanted to do a commemoration of the 10-year anniversary of the 9/11 attack. And they thought maybe we'll have an open mic or some sort of whiteboard where people can come and express their views and their thoughts on this commemoration. And I said, that sounds fine in theory, but what if people get up and say, attack the United States for their imperialist policies? You know, how far do we want to extend this freedom of speech within this setting and this particular context? And I think the organizers had not thought about the potential implications of a free speech area, a free speech microphone, and some of the speech that could possibly result. So they ended up moving in a different direction, which I think was probably appropriate for what they wanted to do. But I think it's worth considering for academic libraries, if we put up a whiteboard with a passive question, what are our policies around freedom of speech with regard to this? And then I know a lot of libraries celebrate Banned Books Week. It's usually in the end of September or October. And this is just an example of a display from a library out west, an academic library out west. And I think Banned Books Week is great. It's a great way to call attention to censorship. It's a great way to call attention to really great books. But it could also land you in hot water, right? If administration doesn't understand what Banned Books Week is, if they don't understand why we're calling attention to these books that are controversial, could it potentially be an area for some uncertainty or some discussion. Programming and displays that celebrate diversity, National Hispanic Month, Black History Month, these sorts of things can cause some frustration in the community. They can cause some maybe concern from administrators or concern from certain elements of the community. So throughout all of this, I'm not saying to avoid this programming, to not celebrate diversity, but just to have forethought as you are going through it. Similarly with acknowledging oppression, acknowledging marginalization. I think it's actually really important that libraries, academic libraries, do this sort of thing, but we want to do so in a very thoughtful way. This is a map that shows where anti-DEI legislation has been proposed across dozens of states. There are initiatives to limit diversity, equity, inclusion, either in K through 12 and or higher education. This map's a little funny, so I highlighted where Maryland is. Thankfully for you all, there's been no bill proposed. But in my state of Kentucky, bills were proposed and barely not presented for a vote. But we anticipate next year they will go up for a vote and they will pass in Kentucky. Basically, this means that curriculum and resources are under threat, as well as the DEI offices themselves. You may have seen headlines throughout the state of Texas. Universities and academic libraries are closing or renaming their DEI offices, their DEI committees, their DEI employees. And this is due to legislation in that state. Often this legislation does not explicitly refer to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes it's called divisive concepts. Sometimes it's called alternative history, actually. And I think this could really impact academic libraries in terms of both like committee work, the orientation of the library towards collection development, towards inclusivity of students and faculty. So even though there's no legislation proposed in Maryland currently, I think this is something to really keep on your radar. Then we have information literacy training. Of course, you probably have seen an image like this, or maybe this actual image. As we know, there are different types of information literacy: digital media, critical literacy. Part of the ACRL framework and part of information literacy more broadly is questioning things like authority and tradition. I think these are very reasonable questions to ask, and I think it's a great way to teach students and others to be really thoughtful about the information they're presented with and that they're consuming. However, if you remember several slides ago, the right-wing movements that oppose changing societal conversations and that want to maintain traditional worldview, they're not going to be as happy with questioning authority and tradition. And typically in academic libraries, we mean questioning authority in terms of questioning like the source material. Is this a legitimate journal, right? But if you start talking about questioning authority, in general, that is going to really concern some people. I think it's also important to think about where we focus with students, especially in one-shot sessions. What sort of search examples are we using? What sort of results are we examining? What databases are we using? All these sorts of things are worth reflecting on. And as I said earlier, some databases have been challenged for linking to controversial sources or topics. And I put controversial in quotation marks here because I don't know how controversial things like sex education are or should be, or academic literature about LGBTQ individuals. But some of this material has been called controversial, and then the databases that link to it get challenged. The final topic that I think academic libraries need to think about in terms of intellectual freedom has to do with social justice. So obviously there are concerns about misrepresentations and depictions of traditionally oppressed communities. And I think there can be concerns about how these communities and individuals are represented in historical documents and historical images. And many people will argue there's a potential for further harm and marginalization in historical documents and images and that sort of thing. Here at the University of Kentucky, we have a mural that was painted, I want to say in the early 1900s, and it shows African Americans picking cotton. And this mural has been the subject of heated controversy, whether or not it should remain up in a building that houses classrooms, whether or not it should be covered. The university at one point hired a Black artist to create sort of a counter piece of art, which she did. And then there were questions like, how can the counter piece of art be fully understood and appreciated without the original art to reflect on? It's been an ongoing controversy for several years here at the University of Kentucky. And actually that building is currently just not used to avoid people interacting with either piece of art. I just think it's important to provide both historical and contemporary context when we are dealing with potentially controversial or sensitive misrepresentations and depictions. I think this is something that most libraries get right, but again, sometimes we can see some quiet censorship or some self-censorship of images, documents, ideas that people think might be controversial. So now I want to pivot in another direction and talk about how we support one another. And this is how public and school librarians can support academic librarians. Academic librarians can support public and school librarians, how we can all sort of work together. Because the current times can seem overwhelming, chilling of freedom of speech, chilling of intellectual freedom. So what can we do if we don't work in a public library or a school library? All of these images on this slide came up when I was looking for graphical depictions of support. And I included this wide variety really to represent that there are many ways we can provide support. Support doesn't look the same for every person. So here are 6 ways that we can really get involved to support librarians. And I want to note that these 6 concrete ways come from a variety of sources. I use social media to ask practicing librarians what they thought would be supportive. I use some listservs to do the same thing. And I spoke informally to public librarians across the state of Kentucky. And this is sort of the boiled down essence of what I heard from actual librarians. So the first way to support librarians is to use the library. This might sound simple, and it is, but you'd be surprised how many academic librarians or special librarians don't have a public library card or don't talk to their children about using the school library. So if you don't have a card for your local public library, go get one. If you have a card but you haven't been in a while, stop in, check out some books, maybe attend some programming. The vast majority of libraries have great websites these days where they list their programming and events. So you can find something that interests you, maybe join a local book club. But use the library. That's one way that we demonstrate its value, right? Is by the foot traffic and the participation in the library. The second approach is to give thanks. As most of us know, librarianship can be a little bit of a thankless profession. We do our job, we help people, we give them access to information, and then they go on their way, right? In a time when public and school librarians are really feeling under attack and threatened, I think you can go a really long way. Write a note, write an email, make a phone call. I think letting librarians know that they are appreciated and that you feel they're doing a great job can really bring people comfort and sustenance during a challenging time. The third concrete way is to stay informed. And by this, I mean, read your library's policies. Watch the local and state news about potential book banning and censorship. I have an alert set up on Google Alerts for intellectual freedom. I get, half a dozen articles a day. Book Riot has a great link roundup every week about intellectual freedom. So there are a lot of ways you can stay informed about intellectual freedom and book banning. And I think it's really behooves us to do that, to stay abreast of the current situation. The fourth approach is to talk about the library. And this can take a variety of avenues, variety of approaches. You can write something on social media. You can talk to your neighbor while you guys are trimming a hedge. Say something in the checkout line in the grocery store. Say something at the Little League game or while you're at your faith organization. Talk about the great job that the library is doing. You can mention the resources the library has. You can talk about how important and valuable it is that they have diverse resources, that they have LGBTQ books or books that talk about systemic racism or police brutality. Talk the library up, really support it. Get other folks interested and involved. Similarly, you can write about the library. And this goes back to social media. If you go to a library program and you really enjoy it, post something on your social media accounts. Tag the library. You can write something for the local newspaper, community blog, community Facebook page. Again, we know people who are unhappy are more likely to be vocal and complain. So to counter that, we need people who are happy and satisfied to be public about that as well. And then the last concrete way to support libraries is to get involved locally. And here's what I mean by that. There's a lot of ways to get involved locally. School board meetings and public library board meetings are almost always open to the public. So you can attend those and find out what's going on. Show up and physically be there to support the library. You can advocate for equitable representation on boards and in the library collections. Make your voice heard. There are national advocacy groups like Unite Against Book Bans and the Freedom to Read Foundation that you can join. There are also a lot of local groups. Ask at your local library if there is a local support group or a Friends of the Library group that you can join. I encourage you to contact your local politicians and decision makers to let them know that you value the library and see if they support the library and if they support library funding. It's important that libraries have trained and certified staff. I'm going to be a little bit controversial and say not everybody needs a master's of library science degree, even though that's the courses I teach. But I think everybody in a library can benefit from having some training on library values, the importance of intellectual freedom, the importance of access to information. And the final point is to vote in local and state elections. And that's highlighted because that's probably the most important thing you can do. And it's also low-hanging fruit, right? But look for politicians who will support the library. Look for people who are not going to be writing book banning legislation, anti-DEI legislation, and voting the right folks into office is really important. So this comes back to using your voice, right? We all have the potential to support the libraries in our area. We just have to use our voice to do so. But as I went through, there are a lot of ways that you can use your voice. So I just want to wrap up by saying that I firmly believe diverse resources in libraries are essential in our contemporary society. Not just public libraries or school libraries, but academic libraries as well need diverse resources. And this allows us to find ourselves in the resources and also to see others. Unfortunately, small but vocal groups oppose this, and this is creating a lot of trouble for libraries and library workers. So we really need to support our local libraries. And with that, I want to thank the ACRL Maryland chapter. I want to thank Brianna and the Intellectual Freedom Panel of the Maryland Library Association. I've dropped my email address here. Hopefully you can tell I have a lot of passion for this. I love talking about this. So if you have follow-up questions or concerns, feel free to email me, but I'm also thrilled to take questions right now.
Thanks, Shannon. That was excellent. I know I definitely learned a few things, and I feel a little more encouraged now about ways that I can support my colleagues in the public and school libraries. If anyone has any questions for Shannon, feel free to unmute and speak them out loud, or you can put them in the chat. We did have a couple comments while you were speaking, Shannon. Keith Weimer, who I think had just had to duck out, mentioned that Virginia also has a divisive concepts legislation for K-12 schools. That was as of 2022. And I know we have colleagues on this meeting who are from all over the country. And if anyone wants to share kind of what's going on in their state right now, feel free to do that. Mike Keel says, I'm always blown away by how many people, even academic librarians, don't use public libraries. Liz DeCoster shared a link for some resources if you live in the Baltimore area and want to get involved in this. Jonathan Newton says we have pending legislation in South Carolina for higher education.
Yeah, and that's the thing. These bills target K through 12 education. That often is what makes the press, but there are just as many bills targeting higher ed. And sometimes those don't get attention, but I think because of the vast academic freedom that we expect in higher education, these bills targeting higher ed can actually be more repressive and more influential.
I think along that lines, I do have one question. Do you feel like when we see a lot of this legislation and outspoken, pushing for book banning in K-12 and in public libraries, can we take that as a harbinger for seeing that movement move into academic libraries? I've heard that before, and I just wanted to hear your take on that.
I think that's a great question, and I do think you're right. I think it is a harbinger. I think, an excellent example is like in Louisiana, where there were some book challenges in some small communities, and then those challenges got a lot more vocal, and then there were challenges in more and more communities. They started firing library board members, started firing library directors. And this has continued to escalate over the years so that now the Louisiana is withdrawing from the American Library Association and potentially making it criminal to associate with the American Library Association, right? It just continues to escalate. And I think we'll see that across all sorts of schooling systems, K through 12, up through higher education. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's part of a bigger push to destabilize public institutions. public schools, public universities. We even see this in things like defunding public parks, public municipal pools, other public services. So I think this is all part of a broader landscape and a broader push in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Jackson mentioned in the chat that he's attending from North Dakota. Legislature is not exactly to intellectual freedom, but most they've done is require public libraries to send a report detailing their collection development policies. And he adds that there are advantages to legislatures meeting every other year. Yeah, so I mean, this can obviously look different depending on where you're located and what your state legislature feels like will get the most traction. Yeah, any other questions? Folks want to chime in on the chat? Oh, got a few more. One, John says, with all the anti-DEI efforts and ruckus over spending public dollars on DEI by legislatures, this could affect public universities in terms of dollars for collection development for controversial areas. And then Jonathan says, as a former public librarian, I always appreciated my academic colleagues who are usually in less vulnerable positions speaking out about local information freedom issues.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely important. I think we're all in this together. And when I teach my library science students, we teach them that school, public, academic, university, state libraries, we should all be working together and supporting one another. We're a lot stronger when we do that.
Yeah, it looks like Mike's got his hand up. Go for it.
We maybe unshare the screen share so that we can see better. No, it's totally fine, by the way. And as a recent 2-screen user, I sympathize with your challenge at the beginning. It's the worst screen sharing from 2 screens. When I talk to students, a message that I try to get through to them is that everybody in the world censors information somehow, in that most of us won't say fuck to their grandmother, for example. And so I guess I wonder, what do you think we should be doing? Should we be fighting more about like the values that we are trying to uphold in making these decisions? Or should we be fighting about who gets to make these decisions? Because it seems to me those are 2 very different things with potentially different likelihoods of success. And I don't know, people might react to them differently. So just what I thought I'd ask what you think.
Yeah, Mike, that's a great question. And I want to say yes, we should be doing both, right? So I've seen some cases where public library boards are like, we're going to take the collection development decisions out of the librarian hands. And the 5 of us who have no library training, who maybe don't have college degrees, we're going to start deciding what should or should not go in the library. That's pretty dangerous, I think. Just like I don't think we want a public university's board of trustees or a state's legislators trying to decide what should go in an academic library. These people are, I mean, these folks may even have good intentions, but they don't have library training in collection development and management. So I think it is important to stay active on that front. But I also think it's really important to convey the values of the library. You know, depending upon how the question is asked, 60 to 80% of the general public opposes banning books. So our library values are in line with the general public, but they're often quiet. They're often not using their voice. And I think often as librarians, we just think libraries are a great thing and everyone knows that. And that's not the case. We need to explain why libraries are great things. We need to explain what our library values are and why they're important to our communities.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, if no one else has a question, about the importance we have for those of us who work in academic libraries, especially in public services, to conveying some of these thoughts and messages to our students. You know, they're at an age, I think, in that kind of transitional period, traditional students, especially, who are, you know, starting to kind of think for themselves and explore ideas on their own, but still only just coming into that. So maybe perhaps not being really aware of some of the thought, you know, conversations out in the wider world. And so I just wondered if you have any advice for talking to students about this, or ways that we can maybe share with them some of these ideas.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I see like the value of libraries and the value of access to information as part of a broader discussion about civic literacy. You know, are you registered to vote in your hometown? Do you value a well-informed citizenry for the sake of a democracy? What does a well-informed citizenry mean? I think you're right. They're just coming into their own, right? Traditional students. And they have a lot of things that they're learning. But I think framing it as part of civic literacy and civic engagement, uh, you know, and looking at the community as a whole, I think sometimes that's a challenge with college students, you know, not just what am I experiencing, but let me get out of my own, step out of my own shoes into somebody else's shoes. So developing that empathy for others, I think, is really important as well.
I know that one thing that our library does here at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County is we invite our neighboring public library branches to table with us in some of our like end of semester events. And I wonder, you know, in my mind, at least it's bringing awareness that the public library does exist, and that they have services that could benefit, you know, college students. And yeah, I see John here mentioned that they also have public library tabling events too. So I wonder if you want to share some things that you've seen of ways that, you know, specific ways that academic libraries have supported, maybe as a group, their public library colleagues, or if anyone wanted to put in the chat ways that their institutions are supporting public libraries.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would love to see ideas that other folks have too. I think inviting them to table is a great option. I think some sort of cross card thing where if you have a university card, maybe you can check out 2 books from the public library or something, or access the public library's ebooks or audiobooks, right? Because those are collections that academic libraries don't always have built up. So maybe some sort of crossability would be useful. I think things like banned books displays can be thought-provoking for students, you know, thinking about what books get banned and why. Those are the ideas off the top of my head. Yeah, referring students and faculty to public libraries when they have resources that the academic library doesn't have, that's exactly how it should work. Yeah.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much, Shannon, for sharing those ideas. Oh, Mo just said Salisbury University, which is also in Maryland, has collaborated with the local public library and the regional library system to organize Banned Books Week events with panelists from across the board, which I think is a really fun idea. Because, you know, they at public libraries have a lot of experience with banned books, and can share a lot of those experiences with us. So again, thank you so much, Shannon. We are going to take a quick break for folks that want to. We will meet back at 1:05 for those of us who want to continue on with this discussion and some small group conversation. So thank you all. We'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Brianna, do you want me to stick around?
If you would like to, I don't know if you want to, if you would want to join one of the discussion groups, just kind of as a, a regular person. Or if if you wanted to duck out, that would be just fine too.
I might duck out if that's all right. I've had stuff piling up all week. I know it's only Wednesday, but it feels like all week.
Yeah, understandable. Thank you so much. And I'll be in touch.
Fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm
you're welcome.
sorry for the problem about the slides.
No worries. No worries.